Introducing the RockLock Pro. Everything you love about the tool-free guitar strap locking system, but upgraded, so you can confidently swap straps between guitars in seconds. Their already high reliability sees an improvement with re-engineered materials and structural design, and you don't even need to apply a soft backing this time. The entire RockLock Pro is fully coated in rubber to protect your valuable instruments. The release clip springs feel especially crisp too. Grab a pair of RockLock Pros or even a 5-pack at the link below, and thank you to RockLock for sponsoring this video. Hey everybody, Ryan here at Plague Scythe Studios. Welcome back to another expedition into the absurd capabilities of the Fractal Audio Systems FM9 and, of course, by extension, the full-fledged Axe-FX 3 platform. Last time, we mostly looked at the additional blocks and different routing and preset configurations you could take advantage of because of that. And while you can certainly sprinkle in those additional drives and amplifiers in whatever series or parallel configuration you wish, I'm going to be mostly focused on the actual input and output of these devices. And again, if you have an Axe-FX, you can actually take advantage of one more loop that I won't be able to, but this will still get you started, I think. So let's kick this off by taking a broad overview of what I mean when I say the additional input and output capability of the FM9. Taking a gander at this reference preset here shouldn't yield too many surprises if you've ever looked at the front panel of your FM9, as most things are represented here, like the inputs 1 through 3, same with the outputs. There's even a dedicated input for the USB block if you choose to use it that way. But there's also some things that don't appear to be there, like where's the output USB block? Where's the SPDIF stuff? Shouldn't these all be dedicated blocks? And the short answer is they're not, because a lot of this stuff is simply the delivery method for how you get those outputs. Essentially, you do have the number of inputs and outputs that you see here, and that's it. But you can choose to deliver those in an analog form or a digital SPDIF form, or even over USB, both in and out at the same time. So that's really something that you have to configure in the setup menu. Go into I/O, and you can choose whether or not, say, input 2 comes from that physical input jack, or if output 2 goes out that way, or you could tell it that output 2 is actually SPDIF, or I want to mirror output 1 for SPDIF like I do all the time, and yet that same signal will still be coming out of the analog output. So the first real thing to kind of wrap your head around before we get into any of this is really these blocks are not necessarily just the analog jacks that you see on the physical device. You can kind of turn these into other digital routing schemes depending on how you're using this thing, and it's very powerful as a USB audio interface in that way. But I wanted to start with the most grounded physical examples, as it kind of helps you put your brain in gear to start to think about these things. At least it does for me, because some of this can get a little overwhelming otherwise. So let's start with the physical inputs and outputs on the device. For those of us that set up most of our own presets, or even if you use the factory presets, you can about guarantee there's going to be an input 1 block and an output 1 block. Pretty standard affair. You have the input 1 for your physical guitar connection that has a variable impedance input, so it can adapt to things like the drive block being a fuzz or a treble booster, and then of course the output 1, which can be anything from XLR jacks to something coming out of the SPDIF output, which is the way I generally record all this stuff for most of these demonstrations. And that usually is going to do the trick for a lot of guitar rigs, right? These things are so capable. There's so many effects there, a lot of amplifier channels, to the point that there's really not a whole lot of need to do most of what I want to show you in this video. But the fact that there is extra processing power and extra analog and digital inputs and outputs does allow you to do things that some of the little brothers of these devices cannot. And speaking of that, if you come from like an FM3 or even an AX8 like I did, there's a few tricks that you can employ to expand that device, because they do have effects loops. On the AX8, for instance, there's plenty of tutorials, and I made one on how to do 4-cable method, which is a very common thing for most multi-effects devices. You plug into that multi-effects, you send an output to an amplifier input, you have the amp's effects send going into another input on the multi-effects unit, and then you have the main output of that unit going back into the effects loop. So if you have an amplifier that's like connected to a cabinet, then you have something that can put effects both in front of the amp as well as within the loop of the amp. And if you're real creative, you can either send the main amplifier's preamp sound through itself, as it would be stock, or you can even replace the preamp sound with a preamp sound coming from that digital multi-effect. So you could effectively change channels as many times as you want, really only limited by the amount of amp blocks or channels available on that device, which is super handy. There's a couple problems with that method though, as you lose not only any ability to have a direct output, because you had to sacrifice it there to just connect with the effects loop, so you can't send anything to a desk that already has the cab modeling from your FM3 or AX8. But you also lose the ability to have a stereo sound, because that effects loop isn't really going to, send a stereo signal over a mono amplifier. There were a couple ways to work around this. I even did like a 7-cable method video where you basically do that twice because you had some stereo input and outputs to take advantage of, and you have 2 separate amplifier heads. And it's a lot easier if you do this with like a load box and you put through a slave amplifier. But again, you don't have that digital cabinet emulation sound that makes things a lot easier to send to front of house or mix or whatever. And if you did choose that digital output with a cab sound instead, say with a loaded 2 amplifier and the effects loop, well then now you can't do 4-cable method or have any wet effects after that amp going into a cabinet. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't. So basically the first thing I tried with the FM9 was doing that at the same time, and lo and behold, it's capable of doing that and much more. So we're going to go into some of those things of how you can build upon those use cases like 4-cable method, like putting an amplifier directly in the loop of one of these effects units and basically do a lot of that stuff simultaneously, or just have more of them all of the time. Starting with a simple expansion upon that 1 tube amp at a time in the loop concept. What if you have a real amp you want to use, but also a real pedal you want to use, because maybe Fractal Audio Systems has a grudge against modeling it for some unknown reason? I hope that statement really ages poorly. The 2 effects loops on this will allow you to have not only this pedal and amplifier in action at the same time, but have them completely separate if you want them to be. Because yeah, you could do this before, but you'd have to do the pedal dance if you wanted to disable this pedal. Whereas with this type of preset setup, well, I could just play the amplifier if I want. Say I have my Cherry Tone Gargoyle going through a reactive load, and it's going through what I'll call effects loop 3. Really, it's output 3 and input 3, and you could make these however you want to have them in any configuration. You could have out 3 go to in 2 and vice versa, just to keep it clean. This is how I'm going to have it, with inputs 1 and output 1 being the main thoroughfare for the signal. But at the same time, if I wanted to just play the pedal, I could have that engaged as well by itself and use the amplifier that is in the FM9. Otherwise, I could definitely have them play at the same time, and you might even want to hard pan one or stack this drive on top of another drive and play the real amp side by side with a modeled amp, whatever you want to do. It is capable in that way. And if you have something like the AXFX 4 that has another effects loop, well, then you could do something else. Let's say have an entirely different set of pedals. Say you got a Strymon collection you like. You could stick that in the effects loop number 4, really number 3, but you know what I mean, and have that be wet effects after all the amplifier stuff, and again be able to mix that with other effects on board. Or you could go completely overkill and have another pedal loop in front of the amplifier. You could have multiple amplifiers. So a lot of things that you can take this core concept, expand upon. But let's see what we can do with an analog pedal, an analog amp, and other digital effects all separately.
Another logical expansion upon 4-cable method is 2 times 4-cable method, which equals 7, because you don't need a second input number 1. I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit and have some solid state amplifiers that are loaded just to kind of be safe, but technically they shouldn't need it. And this will avoid having to use real cabinets in this situation, but you very well could. You could take this exact formula and have the effects go into 2 different amplifier returns and have a stereo set with this setup. But for me, I kind of want to show just how absurd it is that you could have 4 amplifier channels playing simultaneously if you want, or if you had a really capable, let's say 3-channel tube amplifier that was able to switch over some MIDI gizmo when you press different scenes on this thing, you could theoretically switch between 8 different amp channels in the box and then another, let's say 6 outside. So you could have more amplifier sounds than scenes per preset, which would be insane, but another potentially cool use case. For me, I'm going to show you 2 different amplifier sounds playing through the 2 effects loops, being able to blend them or go stereo or however you want to do it, but without the need to play any of these amplifier signals out loud in a room. This is all in the box. If you've paid any mind to any of the bypass states of these input and output blocks, you might notice I'm changing channels and having to manage the output levels some places to make sure that I'm not leaking like a totally clean signal somewhere. And that gets real important in this next demonstration where I'm going to revisit the first thing that I tried, like I said, with the FM9, extra effects loops, which was essentially, you could call it 5-cable method, I guess. But what it is essentially you take whatever tube amplifier you like, or it could be really any amplifier, and you don't have to use the effects loop at all. For me, I'm going to put a load on another amp, and all my tube amps have a slave output, which is effectively a line level tap off the power amp. So that takes care of basically the entire package, just getting the reactive load and the speaker impedance curve interaction and that side of it. And you put that through the FM9 again, or the Axe-FX3 again, and then you can take that signal and put whatever wet effects you want, stereo enhancers, multi-tap delay, big washy reverbs, and you can send that back out to a flat power amp, like something like the Matrix GT. I want to probably cheat in this particular demonstration and repeat the one that I had in the original FM9 video, because my Matrix is off-site currently. But you don't sacrifice your direct output cab modeled sound while still being able to maintain a big lush stereo setup for on stage if you so choose. You can have your cake and eat it too, or have your cab and play it too, have your cab. There's a pun here somewhere, and I don't want to waste any more time trying to find it. But this is definitely something that kind of starts setting apart these higher end modelers compared to stuff that can only do 4-cable method. And for a lot of people, that's more than enough. This is kind of absurd in a lot of ways, because again, with the AX8 or the FM3, you could have a direct one amplifier at a time sound come out of that effects loop or that effects out, and then still maintain a cab emulated sound out of your main output. So that was possible, but you're limited to not only one amplifier channel at a time, so you can't stereoize this with 2 different amps, but you also can't use a tube amp at the same time and still have all that. So this integrates all of those. You could put these amps in parallel to each other in stereo like I have here, or just be able to access them one at a time. And while this is yet another use case that probably hasn't even crossed a lot of people's minds, maybe you can find an excuse to integrate some more of your amplifiers and other real gear with this. While it's no doubt you can go a little bananas with the analog I/O on these devices, at the very least you can physically track down the cables. If you got the same one that's going to, effects loop in and out, it might be a little hard to tell which one's which, but again, you can kind of troubleshoot and track things down in that manner. Whereas with these next demonstrations, it's not quite so simple, and don't be discouraged if there's a little trial and error involved between the way that you have this set up in your preset versus how it's set up in your digital audio workstation, how you assign I/O. And for that reason, I think we should start with the USB port because it is a little easier to grasp. There isn't nearly as many interactions as if you're throwing in other I/O, though you can. There's nothing to stop you from doing that. And in fact, in some of these later examples, you will see that you can mix, USB in and analog outs and stuff like that if you so choose. But this is a really powerful setup for people that, let's say you don't have another audio interface. Say you have powered speakers like I do, and you just have, let's say, an Axe Effects at the center of your music workstation. I think that's brilliant because there's so much I/O there that you could legitimately, like for my use case, run a microphone preamp into one input. You could run other outboard stuff, a pedal board into another input, and you still could use the Axe Effects main outs going to your headphones, going to your monitors, and everything plays through it. It's probably fine. That would work great. For the FM9, it doesn't make quite as much sense to me to leave it as a USB interface, as capable as it is. And, I really enjoyed using it this way because I take it with me places sometimes. It goes other places, and I don't want to, have to rearrange my entire desk every time I do that. And B, I like to be able to, not have that affect my signal path in any way. If I just want to have it be SPDIF out for the digital stuff, if I want to reamp it, with an analog device like I do most of the time, or if I want to be able to have this integrate with other gear or not mess up the way that I have my current audio interface set up, then it just doesn't make sense for me most of the time. But again, depending on your setup, it's probably really worthwhile checking this thing out as a USB audio interface. Just get used to having to relocate your headphone and monitor cables quite a bit. So the first thing to note with this USB stuff is you don't have to use the input USB block. You can, and you can assign it to kind of different channels. And in the global settings, you can change the output assignment of what is out 2 and what is output 3 in the presets, where that actually correlates to in the digital I/O. And then, of course, once that's set up, you still have to go to your digital audio workstation and assign where this stuff is going. So for like Cubase, you have this audio connection screen, and you could say that, for example, my stereo input is indeed output 1, where left is the left side of the block and right's the right side of the block. You can make your outputs and inputs different depending on whether or not you want to use the physical ones or you want to assign, let's say, output 2 to a virtual USB input. So like in one of these later examples, if you wanted to capture the DI output of your actual guitar, then you could just throw one of these output blocks in series, or have it as a little parallel path off to the side. So you could essentially kind of do what we did in the analog domain of capturing a DI signal here, or let's say you wanted to only get the amplifier sound, you could do that and then still have a third track that records your entire signal chain. So that gives you a lot of options, whether you want to scrap the entire take and just have, that as, or at least the entire signal chain for that take and have just that sound as an example, as a reference, or say you really like the distortion texture and the overall profile of the amplifier, but you're not digging how it turned out in the mix with the cabinet impulse response. Well, you can just take that raw amp sound that came off of output 2 in this instance, and you could easily just throw an impulse response in the loop. So you could do a lot of the stuff I'm going to show you with SPDIF with USB. It's basically the most versatile way to take advantage of this device and be able to capture as many signal attributes as possible, and then of course be able to reamp on the box. Essentially, if you're using this as a guitar only processor, there should only ever be one analog to digital conversion, and then only one digital to analog again when you're listening to it through headphones or monitors or whatever. You don't really need another set of conversions because if you record the DI off of this thing, or even if you recorded DIs off of another preamplifier, well, you could just send that all through USB and then record it again back through USB, and then nothing is lost there. There's no noise introduced or anything like that. So it's a really clean way of doing it. All this is probably kind of run-of-the-mill for people that have experienced amp modeling through USB, but I want to show a couple interesting use cases that I found with USB, and again, we'll touch on some of this stuff later as well, where it's not quite as obvious, at least. So one thing about the FM9 and third gen Fractal in general is that the effects are incredible, and even the basic kind of dry effects I think are really good. Like the compressors are great. I mean, they've been great for a while, but especially with a lot of the love and TLC they got in the years following Axe 3, they're like incredible to me. And then of course there's other things that have always been really good. And it kind of always made me wonder, what would mixing and mastering sound like through this stuff? And makes me wish a lot of this stuff was kind of live in a plugin environment. I get why they don't do it, but I would like to use some of this stuff for mixing and mastering. So here's one use case where you could just feed an entire mix, reamp it, for lack of better terms, or remix it, how you would have to do it in the olden days, and using this guitar processor as basically a full mix processor. Let's say you haven't quite gotten to the full mix level yet, but you still want to be able to take advantage of your USB connection. And you can even do this on FM3 for this specific demonstration. So a lot of the times, if we're tinkering with songwriting and stuff, and especially trying out new amplifier sounds, a lot of these things end up being in the form of VST plugins. And of course, where there's no Fractal audio amp modeling solution in a VST plugin, well, a lot of us, will tinker around with other brands, but still like effects that are on the FM9 or FM3 or Axe effects. And why not have both at the same time? There's no reason you can't if you play this over the USB audio interface, as I'm sure a lot of people do. So if you want to just hear the VST plugin on its own and use this as your guitar input, easy peasy. You just have the appropriate track armed in the way that you want it, whether it be an amp modeler product or maybe some fancy delay reverb plugin. Then you can feed it back into the signal chain. Now for this one, I made it real easy. I just got input USB. That way I don't have to assign N2 or N3 to something different. And then that way you hear it out of the main output, but also if you want to have some other effects involved, say you want a specific cabinet sound or want to use a onboard Dynacab here, well, just disable the VST plugins cabinet simulation, and you can even throw on an enhancer block or whatever else you want. This is just a simple demonstration of that while taking advantage of things that maybe that plugin offers that this does not, like a real double tracker or a specific amplifier model. So this is a great way to get value out of your VST plugin collection while being able to use things that are superior on this product. that finally leaves us with what is, without a doubt, the most elusive input-output standard on these devices, and I'd argue just about any music device, SPDIF. And while it may look like a coax cable, this is basically a big copper wire that interfaces to computers, and this is a digital standard. It effectively acts like two channels of USB if you want it to, although with the AXFX and FM9 and FM3 implementations, essentially with especially the outputs, you can just kind of clone a different output. So for me, in almost every instance that I use this thing plugged into this computer, I'm using output 1, but if you look at my actual physical FM9, there's nothing coming off of the output 1, well, outputs of the main XLR outputs. It is simply the SPDIF output running into my interface, and then for my instance where I've got a Focusrite product, I can monitor it and change the panning or level or whatever I want to do, and of course record that very signal in Cubase. Now in the global I/O settings, you can do things a little fancier and start assigning different I/O to that SPDIF port, because remember, SPDIF and even a lot of the USB functionality of this thing is not its own output, right? It's not like you have analog out 1, 2, 3, and then USB 5 and 6, 7, 8, and SPDIF is 9 and 10. That's not how it works. SPDIF is essentially the digital clone of some of this analog stuff. It's just happening before that, digital to analog conversion. So if you wanted to have, output 1 be still analog and you made output 2 or 3, whatever, that digital output, and you had those routed in different ways, you can do that. If you want to go super simple like I have here, and you just record a analog output, let's say of an amplifier, say you wanted to run that to a real powered cabinet for either just in the room reference or maybe some natural feedback, you can do that and then record an all digital cab emulated signal. Or you could potentially interface with your computer's DAW or another dedicated piece of hardware and have a loop of that device that's all in the digital domain. You could obviously do this with analog stuff, but wouldn't it be a little bit cleaner if you could keep all that digital and you don't have any odd level mismatches, or potentially you have a lot more signal to noise ratio, and you could basically treat it as a a digital effects loop block. Now for me, I don't know if it's my cables, I don't know if it's my audio interface, or if it's this device. I have a real strong feeling it's my audio interface, because I've got one dead headphone port and the other one's getting scratchy. It might be time for a new one or a big teardown. Either way, I can't get this to work exactly the way I'd like it to. So I did defer to using the USB port for one of these, which isn't the end of the world. Again, it's kind of best case scenario because it shows just how freaking capable this thing is, being able to use not only the USB audio interface here, but being able to kind of piggyback off of another interface if you were to do that. But in essence, these devices should be capable of forming a loop with another device that has both SPDIF in or out, as long as one of them can drive the master clock signal. And again, I wish I could showcase this exactly, but you'll at least be able to hear exactly what it sounds like. I just can't 100% without a doubt confirm that this is the exact preset structure to do it in, but I'm sure someone else has done it before. The easier thing to do would be, like, let's say you have an input on another device, say you chain, I don't know, an AXFX3 into an FM9 or something crazy like that. You could have the output of that going into the input of the second device, and then of course use the SPDIF output of that device for the final thing. You still only have one digital analog conversion there. So it is a powerful protocol if you want it to be. I think for most people, with how capable this thing is, you're going to stay in the box anyway. USB is all you need and more. However, if, for instance, you have, once again, another plugin that models stuff that is absent on the Fractal firmware, you could use that in addition to a lot of the effects on the FM9 or AXFX. And again, if you really wanted to, you could run those in parallel, stereo, different I/O, whatever. But this really lets you take advantage of hardware and software that you probably already have if you're looking into this kind of professional level of gear. And even if you only take away one thing from this video, what the hell? It's still using this thing to a lot more of its full extent than I think a lot of people do. And that brings me to the end of my list for what the FM9 and AXFX3 can do with their extended I/O capabilities compared to the FM3 and AX8. This is a concept I've been itching to do since I picked this piece of gear up 4 years ago on its pre-order. So if you have the Turbo or the Mark II or supercharged quad core edition, whatever might come after this video because of different supplier refreshes, who knows, then in theory you will have even more processing power to take advantage of this stuff. And I'm sure, depending on how closely this resembles the next generation stuff, a lot of this, just like with the AX8, will be applicable to its newer counterparts. So if you have any other questions, comments, ideas, please leave them down below. I'm interested to hear them, and I will see you next time. Bye.